On December 15, 1872, a merchant vessel sailing through the Atlantic Ocean spotted something peculiar drifting in the distance. What they discovered would become one of history's most baffling maritime mysteries, launching investigations that continue to this day. But here's the thing. This isn't the only forgotten mystery that has slipped through the cracks of popular knowledge. While everyone knows about the Bermuda Triangle or the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, there are dozens of equally mind-bending cases that have been buried in dusty archives and forgotten newspaper clippings. Today, I'm going to take you through 5 of the most incredible mystery stories from history that somehow never made it into the mainstream conversation. These aren't your typical unsolved cases. These are stories so bizarre, so impossible to explain, that they'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about reality itself. We're talking about entire towns that vanished overnight, people who appeared out of nowhere with no memory of their past, and discoveries that defied every law of physics known to mankind. What makes these stories even more fascinating is that they all happened during different time periods, in completely different parts of the world, involving people who had absolutely no connection to each other. Yet somehow, they all share one common thread. They remain completely unexplained to this very day. Let me start with a story that took place in the remote wilderness of Canada in 1930. It was November, and the harsh winter was already setting in across the Northern Territories. A fur trapper named Joe LaBelle was making his routine journey through Lake Anjikuni when he stumbled upon something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Inuit village that had been thriving there for decades was completely empty. Not abandoned, empty. Every single person had simply vanished without a trace. Now, you might be thinking this was just a case of the villagers moving to a warmer location for the winter. But here's where it gets strange. All their belongings were still there. Food was still cooking on the stoves. Sled dogs were found dead from starvation, still tied to their posts. The kayaks and canoes that would have been essential for any kind of evacuation were still sitting by the shore. Most disturbing of all, the village graves had been opened from the inside, and the bodies were missing. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched a massive investigation. They interviewed neighboring tribes, searched the surrounding wilderness for weeks, and followed up on every possible lead. What they discovered made absolutely no sense. The entire population of roughly 30 people had disappeared simultaneously, leaving behind no footprints, no signs of struggle, and no indication of where they might have gone. The case was officially closed as unsolved, and to this day, not a single person from that village has ever been found. But that's just the beginning. Let me tell you about what happened in Taured, a small European country that apparently existed in 1954. A businessman arrived at Tokyo's Haneda Airport carrying a passport from this nation. When customs officials questioned him about his country of origin, he became confused and insisted that Taured had existed for over 1,000 years. He pointed to its location on a map, right where the Principality of Andorra sits today. The man spoke multiple languages fluently, had documentation from various European businesses, and carried currency from several different countries. Here's where things get really weird. The officials decided to detain him overnight while they investigated his claims. They put him in a hotel room under guard and confiscated all his documents for further examination. When they returned the next morning, the room was empty. The man, The hotel was vanished completely on a high floor with no balconies. The windows didn't open, and guards had been posted outside his door all night. Even stranger, when they checked their files, all of his documentation had disappeared as well. It was as if the man from Taured had never existed at all. Moving on to our third mystery, we need to travel back to Victorian England, specifically to the small town of Warminster in 1815. A young woman appeared on the streets speaking a language that no one could identify. She called herself Princess Caribou and claimed to be from a faraway island called Javasu. Local magistrates were baffled by her case and brought in linguistic experts from across Europe to try to decipher her speech. For months, Princess Caribou lived with a wealthy local family who were fascinated by her exotic background. She demonstrated strange customs, performed unusual religious rituals, and drew detailed maps of her supposed homeland. She claimed to have been captured by pirates and had escaped by jumping overboard near the English coast. The story captivated the entire region, and people traveled from miles around just to meet this mysterious princess. But then, something unexpected happened that would turn this mystery on its head. A woman from a neighboring town came forward claiming to recognize the princess. What she revealed would shock everyone who had been following the story and raise questions about identity, deception, and the power of belief that continue to puzzle historians today. The fourth mystery takes us to the American frontier in 1884, where a phenomenon occurred that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about the natural world. In a small farming community outside of Beatrice, Nebraska, something impossible happened that would leave investigators scratching their heads for decades. David Lang, a local farmer, was walking across his property in broad daylight when he suddenly vanished into thin air. But this wasn't a case of someone disappearing behind a barn or into the woods. Lang was walking across an open field with absolutely nowhere to hide when he simply ceased to exist. His wife and children watched from the porch as he took his usual evening stroll across the pasture. Neighbors from the adjacent property were also present, chatting with Mrs. Lang when it happened. One moment David was there, the next moment he was gone. Not fallen into a hole, not collapsed to the ground, completely and utterly vanished. The witnesses ran to the spot where he had disappeared, but found nothing except solid earth beneath their feet. Local authorities brought in engineers to examine the ground for sinkholes or underground caverns. They found nothing. The soil was compact and undisturbed. For months afterward, Mrs. Lang claimed she could hear her husband's voice calling for help from somewhere beneath the ground. But each time investigators dug in the area, they found absolutely nothing. The case became so famous that it attracted attention from researchers across the country. But nobody could provide any rational explanation for what had occurred. Our fifth and final mystery brings us to the bustling port city of Liverpool in 1901, where a discovery was made that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about ancient civilizations. During the construction of a new warehouse near the docks, workers unearthed a collection of artifacts that simply shouldn't have existed. These weren't ordinary relics from Britain's past. These were objects that appeared to be thousands of years old, but made from materials and using techniques that weren't supposed to have been available to ancient peoples. The most puzzling item was a small metallic device that resembled nothing anyone had ever seen before. It was composed of an alloy that metallurgists couldn't identify, despite having access to the most advanced testing methods of the time. The object seemed to generate a faint electrical charge, something that should have been impossible given the technology available to ancient civilizations. Even more mysterious were the intricate symbols carved into its surface, symbols that didn't match any known ancient language or writing system. When archaeologists arrived to examine the site, they made an even more disturbing discovery. The artifacts had been buried in a layer of soil that geological surveys confirmed to be at least 3,000 years old. But carbon dating tests, when they became available decades later, suggested the objects themselves were much older than that. Some estimates placed them at over 10,000 years old, predating any known advanced civilization in the British Isles. The British Museum acquired several of the artifacts for study, but within a few years, something strange began to happen. One by one, the objects started disappearing from their secured storage areas. Museum officials initially suspected theft, but the security log showed no unauthorized access to the vaults. The items were simply vanishing without explanation, just as mysteriously as they had appeared. In Beatrice, Nebraska, something impossible happened that would leave investigators scratching their heads for decades. David Lang, a local farmer, was walking across his property in broad daylight when he suddenly vanished into thin air. But this wasn't a case of someone disappearing behind a barn or into the woods. Lang was walking across an open field with absolutely nowhere to hide when he simply ceased to exist. His wife and children watched from the porch as he took his usual evening stroll across the pasture. Neighbors from the adjacent property were also present, chatting with Mrs. Lang when it happened. One moment David was there, the next moment he was gone. Not fallen into a hole, not collapsed to the ground. Completely and utterly vanished. The witnesses ran to the spot where he had disappeared, but found nothing except solid earth beneath their feet. Local authorities brought in engineers to examine the ground for sinkholes or underground caverns. They found nothing. The soil was compact and undisturbed. For months afterward, Mrs. Lang claimed she could hear her husband's voice calling for help from somewhere beneath the ground. But each time investigators dug in the area, they found absolutely nothing. The case became so famous that it attracted attention from researchers across the country, but nobody could provide any rational explanation for what had occurred. So there you have it, 5 forgotten mysteries that somehow slipped through the cracks of history, from vanishing villages to impossible artifacts. These cases remind us that our world still holds secrets we can't explain. What makes these stories even more chilling is that they're all documented, investigated, and completely unsolved. Makes you wonder what other mysteries are gathering dust in forgotten archives, waiting to be rediscovered.